When people say, who are my intellectual heroes, my personal heroes, and not intellectual, but personally, I would say my grandfather and my father. My father landed at Normandy on the first day, second wave, and he also ran guns for Israel in '48.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome to this exclusive Powerline video series with author and intellectual Fred Siegel, who is one of the most interesting human beings you'll ever be lucky enough to meet. He is the author of several fine books, including a good biography of Rudy Giuliani, an earlier book on urban policy in the 1970s and 1980s, and as far back as the 1960s. And most recently, he is the author of The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism has Undermined the Middle Class. And it has a novel interpretation of the importance of intellectual developments during the decade of the 1920s, a decade that's often overlooked by historians and political analysts. And the book is coming out soon in a paperback edition with additional material added in. We were lucky enough to sit down with Fred for almost 2 hours recently when he was visiting out here in California, and we'll be rolling out parts of our conversation in short installments here on Powerline over the next several weeks. In this first installment, we talk about his early days as a social democrat on the left and how and what kinds of things led him to begin to change his mind and move to the right as he got older. So I hope you'll tune in for the whole series, and here's part one. I remember you saying to me one time that something along these lines, it was 15 years ago or more, that you had your first, I'm not sure you said it this way, you had something like your first clue that the working class was not on the same page as modern liberalism when you were going door to door for George McGovern in Pittsburgh in 1972.
Yes, I was one of McGovern's spokesmen in Western Pennsylvania for the McGovern campaign, and I lived in a neighborhood, middle-class suburb called Squirrel Hill, but I also canvassed widely in the Pittsburgh area, Wilkinsburg, working-class areas, middle-class areas, and the hostility I received was just extraordinary. Just the people took me as an absolute fool, and I was taken aback. I mean, not necessarily always in a harsh way, but just, oh, honey, here's the guy at the door who thinks he knows what he's talking about, kind of thing. And then I spent a little time with McGovern, and then I realized that McGovern thought that Henry Wallace had gotten it right in 1948, and that Russia was not a problem. And to say it knocked my socks off would be accurate. When people say, who are my intellectual heroes, my personal heroes, and not intellectual, but personally, I would say my grandfather and my father. My father landed at Normandy on the first day, second wave, and he also ran guns for Israel in '48. So, my father wasn't intensely political, but when the chips were down, he was there, and he did things right. And he was a very, very tough guy. I watched him. I watched as a young man when my father was a plant manager. Talked down the mafia. He discovered he was a plant manager, and he discovered that he was paying 3 or 4 times more than he should have for garbage collection, and he just canceled the contract. He knew what would happen. And he had me working there in the summers, the boss's son. I was just mixing vats. Helena Rubinstein, their cousin. It was nonsense work. But I saw these guys it's the middle of the summer. They're wearing long, heavy cloth coats and felt hats around. What the hell is going on? So I walked over to my father's office and I stood by the door and I listened to them. And they threatened him. Father didn't say anything. He said, "Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think I understand your position. I'll be getting back to you." And this went on like this for 6 months. When I asked him, why weren't you intimidated by these guys? He said, after you got off the cliffs at Normandy, I wasn't going to be intimidated by anybody. Anyway, at the end of 6 months, he cut a deal with them. They got the contract at half the old price. And that was my. He was a good guy. So my heroes were my grandfather and my father. And another person who had an enormous impact on me was My dissertation advisor is no longer with us, a fellow named Julius Rubin, an economic historian. And Julie, as he was called, once got into a knockdown, drag-out argument with Edward Thompson. Edward Thompson, author of a very famous book, The Making of the English Working Class, which
E.P. Thompson.
E.P. Thompson. It was de rigueur when I was in graduate school. Everyone had to read it. Everyone had to talk about it. And Thompson gave a talk. University of Pittsburgh was the center of what was called the red-hot cliometric revolution. This was quantitative history. And I unfortunately did a dissertation in quantitative history, which I've fortunately lived to regret. And Thompson started talking about capitalism producing food riots. And Julie was a very soft-spoken guy, and you get a sense of where he came. His father-in-law, Julie's father-in-law was Wilhelm Reich. The guy, the Oregon box guy, the strange psychoanalyst, the German who was also loosely connected with the Frankfurt people, but far stranger than they. Anyway, Julie said, "Well, this is not capitalism." He says, "Can you show me?" He said to Thompson, "Can you show me an example where food riots occurred, where there were roads, where villages were connected by reasonable roads to local town centers?" And Thompson seemed buffaloed, and it produced this tremendous exchange between the two. And Julie clearly wiped the floor with him.
I've heard about that argument, maybe from you or read it from you. I can't remember.
Yeah, people have written about it. It was one of those things. This very famous guy comes, and your advisor, who you would admire enormously and you think is very smart, and you're first taken aback that and then not just takes this guy on, but takes him apart, inch by inch. And Thompson was very, like many very successful and famous men, he wasn't happy being shown up. But Julie was a little like my father, soft-spoken. But when it was over, everyone knew who'd won the. And then I think Thompson, I could be wrong, I think it was a 150-page response. It was excessive because
overkill. Right?
Overkill. And another guy, just throwing out somebody who's influential, was Leszek Kolakowski, who wrote an essay called "My Correct Thoughts on on Edward Thompson and a variety of other subjects." And this is before this happened with Julie Rubin. That was another shocker, that he just tore apart Thompson's understanding of Marxism. And I think the moment when I sort of parted ways completely was in '79, when Thompson argued in a public audience in New York that the United States forced the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan, forced the Soviets to invade Afghanistan. And my thought was, what? What is he talking about?